It's Tuesday, March 18th, 2025, and welcome back to Matters of Policy and Politics, a Hoover Institution podcast devoted to governance and balance of power here in America and around the world. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm the Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Distinguished Policy Fellow in Journalism here at the Hoover Institution, but I'm not the only Hoover Fellow who's involved in podcasting these days. If you don't believe me, I encourage you to go to our website, which is hoover.org. Actually, go to the following link, which is hoover.org/podcast. And there you'll find podcasts, commentary. We cover the whole waterfront from foreign policy to economics to healthcare, politics, you name it, we got it covered, including this excellent podcast. My guest today is Andrew Grotto. Andrew is a Hoover Institution Visiting Fellow, as well as the William J. Perry International Security Fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. His research interests center on national security and international economic dimensions of America's global leadership in information technology innovation and its growing reliance on this innovation for its economic and social life. Andrew Grotto is also the co-author of an essay he penned with Hoover's own H.R. McMaster. The title of that is Economic Statecraft, the Need for an Integrative Approach. You can find that on our website as well, hoover.org. I encourage you to go check it, read it. And that's going to be the topic of our conversation today, economic statecraft. So, Andrew, AJ, good to see you.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me, Bill.
My pleasure. So my first question was, what the heck is economic statecraft? But if you bother to read your excellent essay that you and General McMaster penned, you've defined it for us. Let me read it to our audience. You define economic statecraft as the following, quote, a country's pursuit of geopolitical objectives using economic power. These sources of power include U.S. military strength, its global diplomatic reach, the gravitational attraction of American ideals such as liberty and opportunity, and the economy. So, question for you, Andrew. What possessed you and General McMaster to write this? Is this something that we do pro forma when there's a new administration in Washington, or are we looking in 2025 at a rather unique set of circumstances, given what's happening around the globe, given the political reset here back in the United States?
Well, we've been doing economic statecraft in the United States since the founding days of the country. If you think about how the country has grown geographically, that's been conducted primarily through economic statecraft, through purchases of land. Mm-hmm. Other countries, other societies have been doing this since the ancient Greeks, using economic power to pursue any number of geopolitical objectives. And what we've observed in particular over the last, say, 10 years is this acceleration and expansion of use of this toolkit by successive U.S. presidents.
Right.
With issues like U.S.-China great power competition, economic sanctions on Russia in response to its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Being great examples of just how increasingly central this toolkit is to U.S. foreign policy.
How far back are you going with American presidents, AJ? Are you going all the way back, or are you going back to Reagan, or are you starting post-Reagan, post-Cold War?
Well, I think it started to pick up in the Obama administration. And has carried through Trump 1, Biden, and certainly I think we'll see plenty of activity. We've already seen plenty of activity using economic statecraft in Trump 2. But the practice, as I said, has gone back. You can go back hundreds of years and right. Find use of this toolkit. After the Cold War, we kind of collectively expanded our toolkit. We expanded the use of sanctions. If you think about the role that sanctions played in isolating Saddam Hussein in the 1990s, the modern export control regime, right, the regime that tries to control the spread of dual use and other sensitive technologies, was sort of born out of the Cold War. And so, and these tools, presidents find them attractive because they don't involve boots in the ground, and they, in some cases, can actually achieve the objectives that leaders set out for them when they use them.
Okay, so you went back to Obama. So we have Obama, Trump, Biden, now back to Trump. We have this is like watching Oprah Winfrey go on a diet. We're yo-yo dieting here in foreign policy, if you will. But if we go back to your definition here of what's in the toolkit, we're talking military strength, global diplomatic reach, American ideals, liberty, opportunity. You look at Obama, you look at Biden, you look at Trump. Have any of these gentlemen managed to achieve what we would call a balanced approach here, or is each president kind of particularly fond favored one particular approach. For example, you could argue Biden, Obama, diplomacy. Maybe we're seeing here with Trump, he likes to use weapons.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I want to clarify sort of how HR and I use the phrase in our report.
Please do.
Economic statecraft, the toolkit, draws on economic power. There are other tools in the foreign policy toolkit, diplomacy, words and ideas, and military power that draw on different sources of national power. And the essence of economic statecraft is the use of economic power to achieve any geopolitical objective, whether it's economic, it could be a military objective, it could be a diplomatic objective. And obviously, different. Come back to your question. Different administrations put different emphases on aspects, elements of national power in pursuit of U.S. objectives, but. The one trend that I think we've seen, going back several administrations is this rise in the use of economic tools, and in particular, economic sanctions and export controls are probably two areas where we've seen the most growth. You consider, for example, the semiconductor export controls that began in Trump 1 that were extended by Biden and now sort of fallen in Trump 2's laps to decide what to do with them. The idea that we would put export controls on that have the kind of reach that the export controls in semiconductors have, that is, it's almost unthinkable to imagine 10, 15 years ago the U.S. considering controls that sweeping, but here we are. And a big reason for why there's such a heightened focus on economic statecraft is U.S.-China great power competition, which in many ways is a technological competition. It's an innovation competition, which obviously involves economics. And naturally economic tools like export controls have played a big part of the country's strategy across successive administrations to deal with China.
Right, and that economic competition was missing from Cold War I, right?
Yeah. There wasn't a ton of trade between the sort of the Allies and the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact. So the degree of interdependence was virtually zero. The Europeans, did some trade with Warsaw Pact countries, but even there, it wasn't nearly like what you see today with respect to U.S. and allied economic relations with China.
Yeah, I'm not going to do something, AJ, that I probably should not be doing in the age of Donald Trump. I want to talk about two things that are in the news today, and I offer a word of caution here because things move fast as Donald Trump has come back to office. And so hopefully this is not old news or stale news by the time people are watching and listening to this podcast. But let's first turn our attention to Russia. So news out today that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump reportedly had a 90-minute phone call. CNBC reporting that Putin and Trump, quote, agreed that the movement to peace will begin with an energy and infrastructure ceasefire, meaning Russia and Ukraine will not target each other's infrastructure, energy outputs. Fine. Now, here's the U.S. readout. I want to read this to you, AJ. Quote, the two leaders agreed that a future with an improved bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia has huge upside. This includes enormous economic deals and geopolitical stability when peace has been achieved. So I know you're not a criminologist, but those three words, enormous economic deals, kind of scream in the middle of that statement. So what are we getting at here? What are enormous economic deals? Because this strikes me as kind of tricky because at the heart of ending this war is the idea there has to be some Russian culpability here for invading this country. You do not want to, in effect, reward Russia for its bad behavior by giving them trade deals or things like that. So explain to me enormous economic deals.
I can only speculate. Enormous economic deals is a very Trumpian turn of phrase.
Right.
And, we've seen this, going back to his, career as a real estate tycoon in New York. He fancies himself a deal maker.
Right.
Throughout, the campaign this past year, even in speeches and comments he's made since inauguration, he's emphasized how good his administration would be for American business.
Right.
And I think, I mean, I don't want, I'm not gonna, I don't want to, play armchair psychologist here too much, but like my read of the situation is, Trump tends to see the world in transactional terms,
Yes.
and his frame of reference is business, and I think that that it's easy to in some ways to sort of fall into this assumption that economic interdependence breeds peace, and that if only there were no more economic connections between the two countries, you'd have this sort of win-win economic situation that would sort of pave over all the underlying geopolitical
Mhm.
disputes we have with the Russians. And I personally think that's wishful thinking. But
Right.
I think that's the way that the president, sees the world. I think it raises really interesting and hard questions about China as well.
Yes.
What his orientation might be towards China.
We'll get to the end of the podcast, but it stands out to me, AJ, because when we talk about Russia and economic consequences from this war, you always hear this in terms of sticks. Sanctions, more sanctions, tighten the squeeze on Russia. This would suggest that maybe carrots could be involved.
Yeah, and for example, the Russian energy infrastructure is dilapidated. It's not modern. So in theory, there's a big business opportunity for American and allied energy companies to come in and help the Russians modernize.
Mhm.
Um, the Russian economy has been starved of tech, since the start of the war. The export controls have tried to clamp down on supplies of technologies that could be used to advance the war machine from getting to Russia. The controls aren't perfect, but they've certainly had an impact. Getting those controls lifted, has got to be an attractive carrot, from Putin's perspective. But like as you said, there is this underlying geopolitical dispute, right, over
Right.
what forms of government are best suited to liberty and other values. Questions about whether sort of a 19th century view of the world as involving spheres of influence is still the way to think about international affairs today. Putin certainly thinks about the world in those terms. And I'm just not sure how an economic deal paves over those issues unless, we decide that those are no longer issues, and we could just decide, we don't care if maybe if great powers carve the world into spheres of influence. We don't care if an authoritarian leader with a massive nuclear arsenal, kind of gets away with murder, literally. We could decide those things. I think that would be a huge, betrayal of our values and the national interest. But you could imagine a deal where those issues just kind of get paved over. I hope it doesn't happen.
Now let's apply economic statecraft to Ukraine, the other party in the war, and what that might look like. Is it as grandiose as a Marshall Plan to rebuild Ukraine, or what would you look for?
Well, Ukraine's economy has obviously been devastated by the war,
Mhm.
and there are huge infrastructure needs, huge human development needs, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but this is hundreds of billions
Right.
of investment needed in the country, and you know some of that investment, a lot of that investment could come from the U.S. and its allies. I also think that there's a good chance that we don't have the industrial capacity to to hit to supply all that all that those infrastructure needs, and so China would probably benefit as well. I would imagine China has excess industrial capacity and
Mhm.
has become very skilled at undercutting U.S. and allied companies in competition for infrastructure projects. So there's certainly there's a big economic dimension to Ukraine, but
Right.
again the question becomes is that is sacrificing all these other values worth whatever economic gain U.S. Industry and allied industry get out of a deal.
All right. The other region in the news, AJ, would be the Middle East, where hostilities have broken out again. Israeli forces are back in Gaza fighting. U.S. forces are bombing the Houthis in Yemen, and we've suggested that if Iran gets involved in this in any way, we will go after Iran as well. Let's talk about the economic component to settling the Middle East. We talk about peace, we talk about land and so forth, but the economy. So there is a Trump plan to turn Gaza into the into the Riviera of the Mediterranean. Very quietly, there was the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor done in September of 23 under the Biden administration. This is developing a transcontinental infrastructure corridor as well. But tell us a little bit about how economic statecraft will factor into any form of lasting Middle East peace solution.
Yeah, there are a couple different dimensions to it. One is using tools like export controls over semiconductors to try to control access by the Chinese to advanced AI from developing advanced AI capabilities. And
Right.
You've got several countries in the Middle East that are making big bets on becoming technological hubs themselves. So the UAE is certainly one of these countries, and the U.S. has an interest in the Middle East developing digital infrastructure that is based on American technology. There are both economic reasons for that, but also strategic reasons because the alternative is China.
Right.
And from my perspective, the less dependent on China the Middle East is, the better off certainly they will be, but also us here in the United States. China, the Chinese telecommunications and digital infrastructure comes with goodies inside, with surveillance goodies inside, and
Yes.
So the idea that China would expand its surveillance apparatus to these critically important, in some cases, allies is worrying. So there's an economic value proposition. Now we also use economic tools to coerce, right?
Right.
We have economic sanctions in place against Iran, export controls, with varying degrees of efficacy in terms of denying them the ability to access technology for military uses, and also putting pressure on the leaders to moderate their behavior. What's been missing, and this was a major driver of the report that HR and I did, is thinking about these tools in an integrated strategic manner, right?
Mhm.
So we historically we've wielded this toolkit in silos. So if you go talk to someone at the Bureau of Industry and Security, the part of the U.S. government responsible for the dual use export control regime, and ask them what they do, they'll say we do export controls.
Right.
They won't say we do economic statecraft. The same is true if you go talk to a trade negotiator. They don't do economic statecraft. They do trade negotiations. You talk to someone in economic development. We don't do economic statecraft. We do development cooperation. Even though these tools all rely to varying degrees on American economic power, and in many cases involve that there's either synergies between them, or in some cases the tools can work at cross purposes. And I'll give you an example. So as the U.S. has ratcheted up its export controls and semiconductors to China, the main way that China has responded so far is by putting export controls on various critical minerals that U.S. manufacturing relies upon. China has a real chokehold on refining and mining of these minerals. It refines 70% of the world's supply and mines 90% of it. So China has a real chokehold on that critical node in global supply chains. Well, that retaliatory action then fuels interest here in the United States in industrial policy to develop an alternative supply, to incentivize an alternative supply for China. And so we have this synergy between export controls on the one hand,
Right.
industrial policy on the other hand. And we just haven't done a very good job historically in thinking about how these tools can affect each other and even come together and have sort of an amplifying effect. So what we call for in the report is pretty straightforward. And new administration should have a strategy. right? Try to bring these different parts of the economic statecraft ecosystem together to frame out an actual strategy that uses these tools in an integrated manner, consistent with American values, around free market principles, liberty, and other important values. So that's the gist of the report. And so far, haven't seen a ton of indications that President Trump is headed down a path of using these tools in an integrated way, but it's still early days.
Well, in your report, you want Trump to sign an executive order,
Yeah.
which would kickstart this, which would call for the integrated strategy, and it would be done by the National Security Advisor. This is the job H.R. McMaster once had, now held by former Congressman Mike Waltz, and also the director of the National Economic Council, who the last time I looked, I believe, is one Kevin Hassett, formerly, maybe still currently, of the Hoover Institution. So I'm going to joke with you, just why not slip? He's signing executive orders left and right. Why not just slip one in there and see if he'll sign it? But I'm curious why the NSA and why the National Economic Council. Maybe AJ, you want to spend a couple minutes explaining what exactly the National Economic Council does within the White House.
Yeah, well, so the NEC, the National Economic Council, is in many ways the sister coordinating agency to the National Security Council, right? So the National Security Council is responsible for coordinating a national security policy, for overseeing the implementation of the president's agenda, and the NEC is supposed to do the same for economics, for economic policy. And insofar as economic statecraft relies on economic tools, any effort to formulate a strategy has got to involve that part of the White House. Now, historically, and I worked in both the Obama and the Trump White Houses on the National Security Council staff, and different administrations bring a different culture, to the way that they handle these sort of complex cross-cutting policy issues.
Right.
In the Obama administration, especially by the second term, there's just sort of a lot of process. The Trump one, started pretty entrepreneurial and sort of ended up at the end, with a fair amount of process. The Biden administration, same deal. And a big question now is, the first few months of the Trump administration don't show a ton of signs of broad sort of strategic thinking about how these different tools in the economic statecraft toolkit can come together. But it's still early. And in time, it's certainly possible that a more systematic, I hate to use the word traditional, but for lack of a better word, traditional approach to formulating national security policy, right, where you just sort of have this National Security Council process to bring options up to the president, that takes hold. But time will tell. It's still early days, and we're still in this. I use the phrase entrepreneurial, phase of the administration.
I think it might have been the late Bill Walsh, or maybe it was George Seifert who succeeded him. But when they coached the 49ers, they had a rule, which was that basically the first 5 to 10 plays of the game were already scripted. We're going to run those no matter what. And that kind of strikes me as the first, 100 days of the Trump administration. They walked in with a lot of things they wanted to do, tariffs, for example, and we'll get to that in a minute. So maybe this is kind of what you do after you take a collective breath after the first round. But, we talked about NSC, we talked about NEC, but there are other players I'm curious about who would have a potential role in this. What about the Commerce Department? What about the USTR? What about the Pentagon? What about the State Department?
Yeah, all those agencies have an important role to play, along with the agency formerly known as USAID, which is a big part of the development of the economic statecraft toolkit.
Yeah, they've kind of been in the news lately.
They've been in the news lately. Yeah, they have been. We can come back to that. I think the core functions of USAID will come back. I just can't imagine. We need those tools. In addition to all the great humanitarian work that USAID has done over the years, to compete with China, coming back to the Middle East, looking especially elsewhere in the global South, we're not going to. The playing field is not level when competing with China for infrastructure projects, for data centers, for example, which I think you'll see a big demand for not only in the United States, but also in the global South. You know, we can't. China undercuts us on price, and our best option is quality, but price still has to be part of the equation. And you know, there are some tools in the development toolkit that can help address some of those problems. Coming back to the Commerce Department, yeah, I mean, the Commerce Department is certainly a core player in economic statecraft. You know, before I worked at the White House on the National Security Council staff, I was then Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker's senior advisor for tech policy, and I spent a lot of time working on export controls and CFIUS, the process that the government uses to screen for investment for national security risk. And it always struck me that again, we sort of approach these tools in these kind of institutional silos without really um, without putting enough time and energy into thinking through, okay, how do these tools intersect? How can we use them in a more strategic, integrated manner? So Commerce Department's a big one. Well, I should also mention, I mean, it's not just export controls at the Commerce Department, the Bureau of Industry and Security, but the International Trade Administration is a part of the Commerce Department. The International Trade Administration is the agency that does countervailing duties and other trade remedies, which is an important part of the economic statecraft toolkit. The State Department, does diplomacy on economic issues. The Pentagon does economic statecraft. They have this thing called the Office of Strategic Capital that's aimed at essentially incentivizing development of technologies that the military can use that the market may or may not supply on its own. That's economic statecraft. There are dozens of agencies across the federal government that are involved in one way or another in economic statecraft, and that's part of the challenge. Is how do you even begin to identify this group of agencies? And one of the recommendations we have in the report is that this EO that we recommend the president issue to direct creation of the strategy also include a direction for agencies to essentially raise their hand if they do economic statecraft, so that the White House, the NSC, and the president can actually get a full picture of what this toolkit looks like, because it's a sprawling toolkit.
I think one thing I like about this idea, AJ, is it allows this administration, would allow this administration to give some thought to very complicated issues. I'm a big fan of Trump giving more scripted speeches, for example. Now I'm a speechwriter in a past life, so I always come down on that. But my thinking is that the more speeches he would give scripted, the more input he has to have from staffers, the more some speechwriter would have to go around and find out where actually the administration comes down on positions. So let's go through 4 topics here, and let's talk about how they apply to economic statecraft. The big one, tariffs.
Tariffs are a big one. They're popular.
Well, I liken it to economic gunboat diplomacy, that it's kind of the equivalent of parking a battleship off the coast of a nation, that instead of the battleship, you just say, I'm dropping tariffs on you.
With the caveat that tariffs also impose costs on Americans, right? And that's the rub is these instruments are not costless, right? There's anytime the government kind of reaches into the economy, right? There's some cost. Now the benefits may be worth it in the end, but there's some cost. And with tariffs, we'll see what the inflation numbers look like. There's the effect that the tariffs could have on the ability of the U.S. to marshal support for export controls on, to address China's military modernization. Again, a cross-cutting issue that, within this sort of the narrow confines of trade policy, I'm not sure that there's no evidence that I've seen that this administration has sort of factored that piece in.
Right.
Which, to your point, if at some point a more sort of regular interagency process, kind of kickstarts and has actual influence on the president's decision making, you could see then, this more scripted strategic approach come into play, but time will tell. it's ultimately the president's decision how he wants to use his national security team.
Okay, policy area number 2, artificial intelligence.
So in many ways, the U.S.-China competition can be considered sort of a competition about AI.
Mhm.
I mean, there's other technologies that are really important to the competition. Energy, bio, life sciences. But to me, AI is probably the big one because it has the potential to both reshape the way that wars are fought, but also fundamentally change labor markets, productivity within companies, and have very big economic consequences. A lot of U.S. economic statecraft, coming back to the export controls on chips in particular, has aimed at this AI competition, right? The chips
Mhm.
that have been targeted for control are the kind of chips that are optimized for developing and using AI algorithms. China, is almost certainly going to be a fast follower of the United States in AI innovation.
Mhm.
Um, I think we're still trying to get our heads around what that means in practice. What that means for the future of export controls, right? Will the controls have the effect that we hope they have if China's still able to achieve a certain level of sophistication? What does it mean for competition in other markets if China is able to be a fast follower and offer
Right.
AI capabilities that may not be as expensive, that may not be as as innovative or sort of cutting edge as American, but might be good enough and probably a lot cheaper. What does that mean for you know U.S. China competition over influence in the global South? Um, I could talk about AI for days, so I'll stop there and see if you have any follow on.
We may come back to it. The third policy area, AJ, cybersecurity.
Yeah, so in cybersecurity, it's an area I've spent a good chunk of my career
Mhm.
working in. I think we have used tools of economic statecraft in pursuit of cybersecurity objectives. So, for example, I was in the Obama NSC. I was the senior director for cyber policy when the sanctions executive order focused on malicious cyber activity was signed by the president. And you could ask, okay, what when I have this conversation with my students all the time, it's like what does it mean to say those sanctions have or haven't worked if the overall volume of attacks, say from China, haven't dissipated?
Mhm.
And a lot depends on sort of how you define success. Economic statecraft tools have been used. There are export controls that have been imposed on certain cyber capabilities to stop their spread. Um, so, but cybersecurity, I wouldn't describe cyber policy as an instrument of economic statecraft per se. There are tools, however, in the economic statecraft toolkit that are relevant to U.S. Interests in cyberspace.
Mhm. And then the fourth area is semiconductors. I would note that a couple of years ago, the Hoover Institution had a meeting in Arizona, and then Governor Doug Ducey came and talked to us, and he must have mentioned semiconductors about every 30 seconds in his speech because his state was bringing in companies from Taiwan to build in Arizona.
Look, chips are foundational for not just AI innovation, but whether it's your automobile, your refrigerator, chips are ubiquitous, and any country that is able to gain a chokehold on elements of the supply chain for chips um, may find itself with a lot of leverage over its targets. And China has leverage when it comes to the critical minerals and materials that are used in many of in chip technologies. But here in the United States, we have a chokehold over the technologies that are most relevant to high-end
Right.
advanced node semiconductor manufacturing. For the time being, there really isn't a competitor at the high end. For say NVIDIA, for example, produces the most popular chips that are optimized for AI applications. Part of the export controls have targeted the equipment needed to produce chips, in both the controls on the spread of chips as well as the machinery needed to produce them are intended to deny China access to advanced node semiconductors. But over time, right, I mean, China has, an innovative tech ecosystem of its own. It is willing to spare no expense in terms of overcoming this chips uh, uh, barrier that we've put before them. And so there's a good chance that in time, China will come close, if not match, U.S. innovation in chips. Is that in 10 years, 20 years? You know, who knows? But that time will come. In the meantime, China's going to be a fast follower, and even if it's not able to produce the most advanced chips, which, may be most efficient for use in a data center for AI algorithms, if China can accomplish a similar level of performance and innovation
Mhm.
with lower end chips that are more expensive, China will spend that money. And so I think we'll be able to tell in the next, I'd say, year or so whether the export controls that began under President Trump, that President Biden has really amplified and extended, have sort of caught China at that point in the curve where their ability to be self-sufficiently innovative is truly hampered. So stay tuned.
Let's talk about China's economic statecraft, the view from Beijing. What does Beijing do differently from the USAG in terms of Belt and Road, in terms of money for infrastructure in other countries? Is there something the US could learn from what China does? Does China do things that we should be doing?
It's a great question, and there's often I see this temptation in a lot of U.S. Policy debate about China to sort of mirror image what the Chinese do when it comes
Right.
to industrial policy, when it comes to other actions in economic statecraft and beyond.
Mhm.
And there's much we can learn from China. I think
Right.
the Chinese in particular have been really effective going back decades at identifying areas of vulnerability from their perspective in their supply chains and going out and trying to fix them. So, China's energy diplomacy in Africa and elsewhere is aimed at assuring China a supply of fuel. They've done similar actions with iron and certainly in critical minerals where they've been able to really acquire a chokehold over global supply chains. Now, the way that they have gone about doing this is primarily through a combination of state-owned enterprises and heavily subsidized national champions. That's not something that we ought to mirror. We don't have
Right.
state-owned enterprises. We don't have national champions. Um, and so that's an area where uh, we need to find other ways to compete. And I think there it's competing with these companies on quality, right? We can in many cases the U.S. and its allies can offer higher quality infrastructure, whether that's a data center, whether that's a train, you name it. Um, but we also need to get better at competing on price. And so there's been a lot of innovation around how to sort of harness and channel private capital in support of some of these overseas projects. The Development Finance Corporation is the part of the U.S. government that holds the most promise for facilitating those kinds of deals. It was actually created under the Trump administration. China's it's got this excess industrial capacity. We see that in chips where they dump chips in the global market.
Right.
They have excess industrial capacity, which part of their economic statecraft strategy is to go out and find countries to essentially spend that excess capacity. Because if they spend it at home, it has this inflationary impact on their economy, which the Chinese government's very keen to manage. So you see China become the largest source of bilateral investment in the world. Now, the way that the Chinese do uh, call it development cooperation is very different from the way that we have done it.
Mhm.
And there may be something to learn here. Um, the Chinese tend to provide loans,
Right.
whereas the model in the U.S. and OECD countries more broadly has really been to focus on aid. Maybe we ought to think about mirroring that aspect of China's strategy and look at loan, not just aid, but loans as a vehicle for both helping countries meet their infrastructure and economic development needs, but also defend against Chinese incursions, political or otherwise, into some of these countries.
Final question for you, AJ. So Washington has been awash in Doge for the past couple of months. Doge has touched all corners of government, including USAID, which you mentioned earlier. Question for you: will economic statecraft survive Doge, or is Doge going to have an impact on how we economically play around the world?
Yeah, I mean, economic statecraft will survive Doge, but already, the elimination of USAID has removed, at least temporarily, an important tool from the economic statecraft toolkit. The
Don't you
other way,
think part of don't you think part of that will come back though?
yeah, I think some of it will come back, but
I mean, it seems to me you have, not to get too far off topic, it seems you have two pools of money here. One is the stuff that's hard to defend, the stuff that Fox News goes crazy on when you're, you know, sending, $2 million worth of, prophylactics to Uganda or something like that. But then there's the investment side, which is the more serious money, I think. So maybe cooler heads prevail and that side of USAID comes back.
yeah, I think certain core aspects and funding streams within USAID will come back. Now, when
Right.
that happens, who knows? Maybe this summer, maybe later.
Mhm.
But what it's done in the meantime is reinforce for many countries that are sort of sitting on the fence between the US and China, or at least would rather not pick a side, that actually, maybe the Americans aren't the most reliable business partner.
Mhm.
To say nothing of the humanitarian impact, which I think is going to be pretty
Right.
catastrophic. The other way that I think Doge is going to affect economic statecraft is, these kind of mass layoffs, over the last couple months, which have targeted disproportionately federal employees who are in that sort of probationary period of their employment. People who were hired in the last couple of years, in many cases, were hired because of their technological expertise.
Mhm.
And so these are the people who were brought in to help the government think strategically about, for example, how best to develop export controls in semiconductors,
Mhm.
how to advance U.S. interests in AI innovation.
Right.
Where if those people are gone, who's going to pick that work up? The long-term effect on the government's reputation as a good place to work, I think, is potentially catastrophic. Um, Students that have the technical skills to go support development of export controls and semiconductors, for example, are going to have private sector options. And many of them, are certainly my students here at Stanford. Many of them are willing to forego that extra income that would come from a private sector job in exchange for being part of a public service mission and having the opportunity to work on some really cool policy areas that in the private sector just aren't available.
Now, could Doge in some way, AJ, affect the economic statecraft and the great powers competition in this regard? Other nations look at what the United States is doing. They see an administration that wants to downsize government, but also is really not fond of the idea of foreign entanglements. That would seem to present an opportunity for China.
It does, and I think development cooperation area is one where we'll certainly see impacts. The Chinese have been running a propaganda campaign to denigrate the effect of U.S. export controls on China, to try to um, persuade Americans and the Europeans and the Japanese, all of whom have important roles to play in the supply chain and therefore are key to have on board these export controls, that the controls aren't working, that they're futile, and therefore why bother? Why impose costs on your own domestic industry if you aren't going to achieve the objectives that you hope to? And it doesn't help the U.S. In making that case when you have the president doling out tariffs, like he is. And in general, treating allies like punching bags. It's hard to you can imagine the conversation that an ally has internally if the U.S. says, "Hey, look, we need you to roll back, for example, your export of semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China." On the one hand, on the other hand, we're going to beat you up economically. There's just a cognitive dissonance there that I don't think the administration has thought through yet, and comes back to the need for having an integrated strategy and the use of all these different economic statecraft tools.
Well, when the man's not doing tariffs, he is signing executive orders, and maybe who knows, AJ, one day yours is going to show up.
I hope it does. And there are some really excellent people working in the administration, and I hope that they are empowered to pick this up and run with it.
Okay, we're going to leave it there, AJ. Congratulations again on the paper. It's titled again, Economic Statecraft, the Need for an Integrated Approach. You can get into the Hoover Institution website, hoover.org. So definitely check it out. So enjoy the conversation. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Great to be here, Bill. Thanks.
You've been listening to Matters of Policy and Politics, a Hoover Institution podcast devoted to governance and balance of power here in America and around the free world. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to our show. If you wouldn't mind, please spread the word. Tell your friends all about us. Andrew Grotto, he is on social media, brave man that he is. His X handle is @GrottoAndrew. That's Grotto Andrew, @GrottoAndrew. The Hoover Institution has Facebook, Instagram, and X feeds. Our X handle is @HooverInst. That's HOOVERINST. And while you're there, you should sign up for the Hoover's Daily Report, which keeps you updated on what Andrew Grotto and his Hoover colleagues are up to. That's emailed to your inbox weekday afternoons. Andrew Grotto, as I mentioned, co-author of the essay pen with H.R. McMaster, Economic Statecraft, the Need for Integrated Approach. Once again, that's at the Hoover Institution's website, hoover.org. For the Hoover Institution, this is Bill Whalen. We'll be back soon with a new conversation. We'll be talking education reform with my colleague Michael Hartney, what's going on in Washington with the Department of Education, also where education stands 5 years after the pandemic brought classroom instruction to a halt, so you don't want to miss that. Till then, take care. Thanks again for joining us today.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we generate and promote ideas advancing freedom. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.